Do you still see my screen?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. Thanks very much to our Kids Network, and thanks a lot, Liz and Rebecca, and the team for the invitation to share with you. I also really appreciated that land acknowledgement. I grew up on the lands that I now know are the Haldeman track of the around the Grand River that were promised lands to the Haudenosaunee people, but I didn't know that at the time. And so I appreciate now that I live in Vancouver learning more about the treaty process and the ongoing efforts for Indigenous revitalization in Ontario. I'm going to talk about neighboring today, and it's a topic that I find fascinating and I have been involved in working on and thinking about for the past decade. So I'm going to introduce some research, some policy and practice work that revolves around Vancouver and the broader Vancouver region and the work is all oriented towards putting neighboring on the agenda in terms of social connections in communities as they grow and as they change. These efforts have spanned a number of partners, including community foundations, local governments, health authorities, housing providers, and a community of practice called the Hey Neighbour Collective that I'll talk about as well. So I'm going to provide some research results. I'm going to provide some sense of some of the policy results that we've obtained. And I'm going to share some stories that I've heard during engaged research with people in vulnerable situations about what neighboring means to them. And then towards the end, well, in the last half hour, I'm going to ask for your advice in a brainstorming session about some of the sort of what I consider to be some of the most challenging conversations that we've had about neighboring and how neighboring can help people in vulnerable situations. So the thrust of the message is going to be that the nature and the meaning of neighboring has changed in Canadian cities compared to when I was a kid growing up in the suburbs, and neighboring was sort of this thing that you would do once you got to a point of owning a home and having a need for a neighbor to loan you a cup of sugar, or when the grocery store was closed, or perhaps bring in the newspaper when it was delivered, rather trivial things, but that those practices and the meaning of neighboring has changed, but that neighboring remains important and in fact a crucial component of community development and quality of life. So I just wanted to add a little bit of land acknowledgement from where I am today in Vancouver. The work that I'm going to talk about took place on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the three nations, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam, or the Whamaskweem nations, that have shared this territory and parts of this region from time immemorial. And when researching and creating plans and policies about neighboring practices, I recognize that the colonial practices that I talk about and that my profession as a planner perpetuates have segregated and isolated Indigenous peoples intentionally, structurally, and by design, by prohibiting cultural practices, separating families and communities, and breaking ties to language and culture. And Indigenous peoples are part of the diverse urban communities that this research involves. And they're part of generating and signaling the revitalization of a sense of welcome, community, diversity, and neighboring in the city. And what's depicted here is a good example of this. It's a mural on the abutments to the Granville Bridge, which leads sort of extends Granville Street from the southern part of Vancouver to the downtown peninsula. And for those of you who have visited Vancouver, it's bridge abutments on Granville Island, which is a popular place that you might have visited. This is by Musqueam master weaver Deborah Sparrow, and it's a mural project that she calls Blanketing the City, which is a project to decolonize the notion of arts and culture in how it's represented in Vancouver and to sort of fight back against the erasure of Indigenous presence in city spaces. So the notion of blanketing the city is a Coast Salish tradition that when visitors would arrive, that when they were welcomed, they would be given blankets to know the sense of welcome and the sense of being invited to stay. So I take seriously my responsibility under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, including the call to action number 54, which is related to education and skills-based training in Indigenous and intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So here are the sort of four themes that I hope we can touch on in this presentation. Connecting neighboring to important issues of health and housing. And I'm going to talk about a few projects that I've been involved in the past decade that have done that pretty persuasively, I think. The Hey Neighbour Collective action research project that I mentioned and what it's done to take up social connectedness work within regional planning and policy in this region, Metro Vancouver. The threat of the emerging asocial society and what can be done, and how neighboring is part of the response to the need for pro-social programming and policy. And then a spotlight and brainstorm with you on some focus group research that we've done related to the challenges that people in vulnerable situations face when it comes to their neighbors and neighboring. So I was wondering if I could ask you to think about the most neighborly housing situation that you've ever lived in and what made it that way. And maybe if you wanted to just think about that for a moment and write your answer in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so. When we've asked people who live in community housing and vulnerable housing situations, here are some of the answers that we've gotten. What is a neighbor to them? That neighboring is something simple. It's saying hello, it's social recognition. It's just not being ignored when meeting one another in the hallway. That people who are asking how you're doing, things like that, that sort of makes the people feel like you're paying attention to them. A good neighbor would be someone who knocks on your door. So that's a step further and says, hello, how are you? And just checking in on them. And a good neighbor is one who will let you know that you're a good neighbor when you're being a good neighbor and that you're not so good when you're being a bad neighbor, and you can be confident in speaking to them. And these kinds of definitions came about when we were asking in a focus group setting for residents who live in some very dense communities in the Vancouver region. What are their experiences of their neighbors? Are they interested in getting to know their neighbors better? What is their sense of social connectedness to their building community, to the neighborhood that surrounds their building? And how does this all relate to what we have as an explicit policy and planning agenda, which is community well-being, which is a sense of feeling good in terms of mental, physical health spectrum, and being able to have the kinds of relationships that you need within your daily life in order to meet your own needs. So this research that I'm going to talk about all sort of involves those three components and figuring out where are we going, with these trends, and both in terms of the built form of our cities towards more and more and higher densities of housing and neighborhoods, and then also towards promoting social connections as a way to make communities more welcoming, to resist processes, antisocial processes, and to build up a sense of community well-being. And I mentioned that, my own experience of what neighboring was is very different from this kind of approach to understanding what neighboring can mean. And I want to present, first off, a project from 2014 from Vancouver Coastal Health, which was my first exposure as a researcher to the real consequences of not having a neighbor. And this analysis here, these couple of results that I'm presenting here are based on the first health region-wide survey that we conducted in this region. There were 40,000 respondents to this survey, and it was the first one to systematically connect the social determinants of health to mental and physical health outcomes. So here we are able for the first time to statistically say that health and social connection are positively related, with social connection being defined as the subjective experience of feeling close to and a sense of belongingness with others. And that's a definition that sounds quite ethereal and difficult to pin down or define, but based on these survey results, which again was a large sample from across a diverse region, we found that individuals who had a strong sense of community belonging had 2 times higher odds of reporting excellent or very good mental and general health. And those who had 4+ confidants, which means a confidant we defined as somebody who you have the phone number of and would feel comfortable calling on for help in an emergency when you might need urgent help, that people who had 4 or more of those people in their social network had 1.5 to 2 times higher odds of reporting excellent or very good general and mental health, respectively. And these are results for our region. We've also seen across Canada, across sort of what we call like the developed world, similar relationships, and sometimes they're reported on the negative side, right? So you might have seen headlines, for example, that feeling lonely and not having a strong sense of social connection within your daily life is as dangerous to your health in terms of risk of heart attack and disease and serious disease. It's as dangerous as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, for example. That's not just a flippant remark. That's actually based on survey research like this by Janet Holt-Lumstad. So I mentioned philanthropic organizations. The Vancouver Foundation, which is our biggest philanthropic organization in the Vancouver region, took notice of the My Health, My Community research results, and they took it on as part of their vital signs reporting efforts. And they looked at sense of belonging and social connection, and they found that there are some interesting trends. They found that renters, people who are new to the neighborhood, people who are students, and people who are new to Canada have unusually low sense of belonging. Retirees and older people actually have unusually high sense of belonging. And increasingly, the population in the region is living in multi-unit, high-density built environments. There are more and more renters, within our population, more and more students, and more newcomers. And this has consequences for the sense of social connections and belonging. And so this was really a wake-up call within numerous kinds of policy domains in the region that led to a series of planning and policy efforts that continue to this day. So the rallying cry then is that municipalities that are growing and which is something that generally communities want, are facing some serious risks when it comes to social connectedness, and that these have important consequences for housing, health, and social policy goals. The Hey Neighbour Collective is the other piece of the puzzle of this research sort of journey that I wanted to present to you. And this is a group of housing providers, researchers, policy advocates, and policy wonks in health and social connectedness or social policy and planning throughout the British Columbia, but mostly in the Vancouver and Victoria metropolitan areas. And we have this series of goals that we're trying to tackle. So we're hoping to uncover what we know from the research about the relationships amongst housing, social well-being, community resilience, or the ability of communities to respond when those emergency scenarios do arise, as you know, has become important and sort of on the front page for everybody coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, and neighborliness. And we work in partnership with housing providers and some third parties, social service agencies like the United Way and Wholeway House in this region. Building Resilient Neighborhoods is another one, who work as social service providers hand in hand with housing providers in order to create more sociable environments. And we're trying to create more of a sense of continuous improvement and advocacy for more effective resident-based and engagement activities. We work in partnership with advocates and planners to advance knowledge-based policies and programs for sociability, and we build place-specific knowledge to inform better policies and collective initiatives. So we have, for the past 5 years almost, conducted surveys of residents. We have engaged residents in Photo Voice, which is, for some of you might know, a storytelling, sort of a pictorial-based storytelling approach in which we sort of offer residents the opportunity to contribute to research by taking photographs and telling stories about those photographs and why they're meaningful to them. We conduct policy and research background and synthesis, and we do observations of spaces and activities. And this work actually started out as a pilot project within the city of Vancouver. For 18 months, for a year and a half, the city actually funded a few resident advisor positions. So these were people living within community housing settings who were given a small stipend to volunteer to be a social connectedness sort of advisor within their building. And then the city also provided some navigation support to enable those resident advisors to, you know, make certain activities and engagements possible within the community. And so those included things, you know, that they ranged from sort of lemonade stands to movie nights to emergency preparedness workshops, to even some conflict resolution skills building workshops for residents, and a variety of things. The survey research that we've done with residents has been really eye-opening. We've found that mental health of residents has declined compared to the pre-pandemic situation across the board. We've also found that the number of close friends has a correlation with perceived mental well-being of residents. So that's as we would expect based on the My Health, My Community research. And we find that individuals who have fewer friends and social connections are more likely to report poor or fair mental health. But at the same time, we've got this sort of ray of light that we found half of respondents were willing to get to know their neighbors better. And at first blush, that might seem like kind of not such a positive or an enthusiastic response. But in fact, given the challenges that community housing residents face in terms of their social environments and their relative lack of power to change their social and their economic conditions, we think that that's actually quite impressive, that there are 50% of people who are willing to say on a survey that they're ready to make new friends, to make new connections, to try some new things. We found that over half of respondents have conversations with their neighbors several times per week or every day. That was encouraging. But we found that 30% of respondents feel lonely, often or some of the time. And we found that frequent conversations between neighbors occurs mostly in the building's common areas. So we asked sort of, well, where do you make these connections? Thinking that probably the lack of space to make these connections and to build relationships in a safe way is part of what's standing in the way of developing trust and a meaningful sense of connection. And we found that we're justified in thinking about that. So it is vital to provide the settings for these conversations to happen. That social programming, in order to increase social connections and neighborly feelings in different demographics, requires different approaches as well. The length of tenure, so the length of time that a person has been within their apartment at the time, does impact the willingness of people to connect with their neighbors. And yeah, and so we found a number of, and this is the results of the first year of the survey, but we have continued. Here are the results over 3 years of asking about, are you willing to get to know your neighbors better? That question, because we think that that's a real key to knowing, like, if we offer these programs, if we sort of try and invest time and effort to build up social connections for residents to be able to consider themselves a neighborhood, is it going to help? Will people who are most sort of likely to need these kinds of connections or benefit from efforts to increase the exposure to these connections, are they likely to participate at all? And we do find some troubling trends, although it's a mixed kind of picture in this graphic, that likelihood to want to get to know your neighbors better may be decreasing. So we do, the sense of sort of polarization of communities in the sense that maybe there is no real meaningful likelihood of making connections that matter, that there's a risk that is growing. At the same time as we're asking these questions, we are trying a bunch of different things, and I'm interested to hear what some of you are trying as well when we get into the brainstorm session. So here, this is just the cover of our our initial photo voice project that I mentioned. So we did this during the pandemic, the sort of, winter of 2020. And we offered like an Instamatic camera, and we offered some scrapbooking tools, and we offered a sort of guidance and an opportunity to check in and reflect on their experiences to a number of residents. And we asked them, where do you feel a sense of connection to your home and your neighborhood during the COVID pandemic? This story about this picture on the cover is just kind of an interesting one. This is a woman who took it upon herself just to sort of make this comedy stand out of some materials that she was able to find. And she did it on that's sort of the corner of the block. And she just offered jokes to passersby in a safe environment. That's sort of over and above what one might expect most people would be willing to do for their neighbors. Other types of activities, including solo ones, certainly gardening appeared to be a real connecting force. and opportunities and some basic resources to create gardens in multi-unit housing was seen as a very beneficial kind of opportunity by many and featured strongly in those pictures that were shared in the reflections. And here's a snapshot of how we've been able to make the case at the regional policy table that social connection and sociability through the built environment is a regional growth management issue. So in Metro Vancouver, we have what we call a collaborative system of regional government. So the region creates a growth management strategy, and then each of the municipalities within their official community plans creates a narrative about how they situate themselves in the context of the Metro growth strategy. So in Metro 2050, which is our latest iteration of the regional growth strategy, these are, through our advocacy, these are the 4 items that we were able to include within that strategy. So we've got that municipalities will consider social connectedness when planning for infill of urban centers, which is that high density residential and mixed use development that we were talking about. That municipal planning agencies will provide public spaces and facilities to support social connections, and that's a very important point related to social infrastructure, which is the structures as well as the community spaces and the community capacity or capabilities to create social connections. So I'm talking about community centers and neighborhood houses, and also parks and trails and even chat lines. So they don't have to be physical spaces, but certainly that's an important part of it. To provide design guidance to promote social connection. So certainly our research has revealed that how you design a space can make a big difference to whether and how people use it for social connections. And municipalities must also identify policies and actions that contribute to social connectedness. So this is a big policy win for us. It remains to be seen how municipalities are actually going to wrap their heads around this when it comes to the specific plans. And of course, now we're growing at a very fast pace in terms of the new housing and built environment developments. So it's crucial that we get this, that we start taking this seriously at this time in particular. Yeah, so this is just a sense that so we have started to work with some of these newer buildings. We're starting to see new purpose-built rental buildings in communities across Metro Vancouver now, which is a big change for us. For at least 30 years, there were almost no purpose-built rental buildings. They were all condominiums. But now we are getting new opportunities for market and below market rental buildings, and more nonprofit housing organizations that are trying to design these buildings and to create them with management structures that enable people to feel more connected. And those are some of our strongest partners so far with the Hey Neighbour Collective, trying to find new and creative ways to make sure that people aren't sort of stuck. They don't have a sense of that they have a sense of contributing to their built environment, to their residential living situation, as opposed to feeling like they've been placed in this housing situation. It's the people that they live close to are not important to their daily lives. Yet we know that sense of connection is important for reasons that I've tried to sort of outline. But we also think that there's a really strong case to be made to the housing providers that this is going to make their work easier. After all, we think that the sense of sort of resident ability to make things happen can reduce the sense of dissatisfaction with the living environment. It can reduce the turnover rate, which is something, and it can improve the quality of caring for one's local and neighborly environment as well as, of course, to reduce the occurrence of the most serious consequences of loneliness. And and we've heard terrible stories about what happens when people are severely isolated in their homes and don't have any or don't feel like they have any place to call for help. I mentioned trying to find out what other places are doing, and that's an ongoing work. But here's the results. Here's the cover of a project that we did for the Imagining Canada's Future Challenge, which is a joint project of Social Development Canada and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So this was and they proposed this term, emerging asocial society, which sounds very ominous, but I guess, you can't ignore the fact that there are certainly indications that the kind of severe polarization and the very asocial or even antisocial consequences of that are real and apparent for an unacceptable number of Canadians. So we looked around and we found that there is a large quantity of research on this topic. This is just a sort of a confusing software display of the number of citations that we found related to multi-unit housing, neighborly relationships, and social quality of life. But perhaps more surprising is that when we filtered all of these through, amongst the articles that we found to be really specifically related to the policy need in Canada, we found that there was research in 25 different countries. It came from a variety of disciplines, but only one article was found specific to this issue in the Canadian context. It was an article about the case of Regent Park, social housing project in Toronto. So we have a lot to learn from some of the other countries that are shaded in blue here on this map. But we also have a lot of looking at ourselves and our own practices to do in order to figure out what is really going to work in Canada and Canadian communities in order to take neighboring into serious consideration when we're trying to design programs, to design housing buildings, to design opportunities for people to get involved in shaping their own communities. Because it doesn't happen by accident when we're talking about the kinds of levels of polarization and diversity that that are now a reality in our communities. So here's a general model of the factors that we found to influence social quality of life in high density built environments in that literature review that I just mentioned. And I'm not going to go through these exhaustively, obviously, but I invite you to look at the policy summary or the full report for those of you who are doing work in this area. We did find, some very interesting dynamics to be at play. And these are sort of a list of the major variable categories and then some of the more specific variables that we found to be relevant and important. So ranging from individual and structural characteristics to characteristics of the housing structures themselves to personality and sort of that endless debate between introverts and extroverts. Also factors of social, discrimination, essentially, the sense of social separation and the need to maintain that in order to because of bias, essentially, and discrimination. But the ones that are circled in yellow are the ones that I want to just talk a little bit about in order to give an illustration of how um, we might want how we can sort of really hone in on how to affect and improve the social quality of life in high density social environments, for high density environments, um, specific to immigrants. Because I think that many of us might be looking at that issue in particular. So this is an illustration. So what we find from the research that we reviewed is that immigrants face housing discrimination, and this discrimination discourages social connections, right? So often immigrants to Canadian, well, this is related to research across the world, but immigrants are often unable to acquire secure tenure. So they are less likely as a result to feel like they're only in a housing situation for a short time, and therefore it's of less value to them to make meaningful social connections. Immigrant tenants are more likely to feel stigmatized based on differences in income or household composition. So having a larger household than their neighbors, for example, and that there are stigmas based on perceived antisocial behaviors. And this has a negative impact on their social quality of life. This may result in immigrants defining their residential area in very bounded spatial terms, right? And these would be what we would refer to as enclaves often. And in their efforts to feel at home in a foreign place, they may develop a strict sense of the boundaries and roles of their immediate spatial community, and they may oppose changes. And so this can lead to, different strategies that are needed to address these. In their efforts to feel at home, some immigrants seek to maximize compatibility. So residents' life experiences at their previous residence carry with them, and those affect their willingness and ability to connect socially. When moving into a higher density built environment for the first time, an individual may have nostalgia for their previous residence or their environment, and this can drive negative perceptions of what they're looking at when they look around at their new context. Just because something is physically close in a new environment doesn't mean that there will be social interactions there. Um, However, and so we have this policy of social mixing, right? At least we do really promote that in Vancouver. And the sense is that rubbing elbows with people who are different from you in close quarters will eventually lead to integration and understanding. That's not necessarily the case. It's not a done deal because of the discriminatory practices that can happen, particularly to certain immigrant groups. And we found that these practices include a lot of unfair housing practices in rent, in using building systems and spaces that can really decrease the sense of social integration and community social supports. Nevertheless, we do find that within those communities, there can be a strong sense of social support and a valuable sense of belonging, including things that are surprising in a high density environment, such as an open door policy with neighbors, even though that is, a compromise to one's private space, even when private space is really at a premium. And we found that building management systems can make a big difference to immigrant home life. So often, and that includes things like the managers, right, that are there all the time, the landlord to whom you pay the rent and that sets the rent policies, and resident management relationships. So whether there's an open line of communication, often there's a push by larger landlords or busy landlords to move to online systems of communication that can be confusing, especially if it happens in a language that you're not completely versant in. And that flexibility can be a real savior when it comes to building relationships inside a building between residents and management. Flexibility, including opening up opportunities for immigrants to convert spaces to meet their own needs, including needs for prayer, needs for economic activities, needs for childcare kinds of activities, or social spaces. So the purposes for which common areas may be designed are not necessarily the purposes that the residents need served. And openness of management to understanding those different needs can make a huge difference in terms of the social quality of life, without necessarily incurring, a major cost. So a shift in attitude towards community building is an important aspect for high density environments that are meaningful and socially high quality for people. So I'm moving into the final portion of the ideas I wanted to present to you today, and then I'm going to move towards asking for your brainstorming help too. And so in order to do that, I want to take a look at the expectations that exist within your organizations, and that you think exist within the public, within civic organizations towards neighboring. So here, this is the gold standard in Canadian practices for building opportunities for social connections in neighborhoods. This example is the community center that was built as part of the Vancouver's Olympic Village in 2009. And it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek because it literally is the gold standard. This, in fact, was built to meet LEED Platinum, not even, it's sort of above gold in terms of green building features. But this was, I think it was a $33 million facility at the time. It offers, a large number of multi-purpose rooms. There's that kind of nice playground area on the rooftop is a childcare facility. There's some commercial restaurant space in this, and it's on the waterfront. It's like, no doubt, this is a beautiful facility. It's really valuable for the community, but I think we need to admit that building a community center at this scale can't be the only way that we go about promoting neighboring. And we need to think about this in terms of, lower cost options, smaller scale options, and options that offer a wider diversity of possibilities for neighboring. So I'm going to present now some of these quotations from some of the residents that we spoke to about what they have found to be valuable in neighboring and the risks involved in neighboring. As we think about, and then I'm going to ask for your ideas about what we can do in order to provide better and more opportunities to encourage neighboring. So this resident has, identified here, she's identified an opportunity. She's got this neighbor who is seeking her help with a resume. It seems, she's interested in this person and potentially forming a relationship, is really happy to provide the help. And there's this inkling that she wants to invite her over. But I don't know, but the comment is, I don't know what I'd be getting myself into. And there's this sense that of not knowing, not having a common or a shared social ground to make neighborly relationships that aren't going to put people ultimately in difficult situations when there could be consequences down the road that would be hard to then get oneself out of. And this leads to a broader sense that the availability, the type, and the qualities of space to gather in a neighborly way they're variable, right? And those spaces matter, as these four very different kinds of gathering spaces illustrate on this slide. So the kinds of things that we're seeking to encourage are really they're evident in the kinds of choices that are made about what these spaces look like, how they're oriented, Do they provide for intimate versus non-intimate kinds of conversations and connections? Are they non-threatening? How many people are invited to stay here? Who couldn't stay here in a comfortable way? Do they lend themselves to activities that are active or restful? Are they open to use at different times of the day or in different weather? So I would just invite you to look at these four spaces and think about the differences that each one makes to the different kinds of social connections that may or may not happen inside them. Here's a quotation from a focus group participant who wanted to let us, who, identifies as an introvert and who wanted to let us know um, that the activity, that providing not just the spaces, but some kind of purpose for the engagement can make a big difference to their ability. They have the willingness to connect with their neighbors, but to their ability to strike up a conversation. So they say, I think it's easier to strike up a conversation when you're planting your flowers and they're planting their whatever it is. They're cleaning their yard or whatever, or getting the paper. So you would make small talk, but you're doing an activity while you're doing that. In apartment living, there is no activity in the hallways. It's just a hallway and doors. There's no activity because there's no common yard. So this really points to some of the kinds of um, built environment design choices that can be made within a building. And that there are consequences in terms of the actual space that's available within a building. Um, but we are seeing more interest in making optimal use of all the spaces in multi-unit buildings. So this is on the left an example of a rooftop garden for vegetables. Um, that one is in Victoria. And of course, different designs, whether these are collective gardens or allocated to particular units. You can imagine some people who might not get along so well with the very precise straight rows of this garden, or might want to plant different kinds of food or different kinds of plants. And then on the right, I mentioned briefly earlier an organization called Whole House, and this is a third party, so it's an independent social service nonprofit organization that partners with community housing providers in order to just sort of establish a presence and a continuous, a dependable presence within a housing building. And here they've taken what used to be, this was a building that used to be for veterans. It was built intentionally for veterans. And they used to have a bingo hall. And now they've taken up built this bingo hall in order to provide a weekly cafe, a coffee time with food and with games. You can see this is a really well-stocked craft and games room. And so their idea is not to have a specific kind of thing that they do for residents, but really to focus on the whole variety of things that can happen when people get together without any specific expectations. And we have found that this kind of an approach does have the impact of improving the gender balance of people who participate and the age range of people who participate. This is quite successful with immigrant tenants who will come by and have particular questions that they might want to ask for help with, that they can follow up with. And it also has had a marked positive effect on food security, just having that weekly knowledge that food is available and you can go and share a meal with your neighbors. Oh, here, I'm going to skip forward because here is this example that I provided of Whole House. So, and this graphic, this infographic here shows, the comparison of the number of people who live in buildings within the New Chelsea Society, a particular nonprofit housing society in the Vancouver region, who don't have Whole House operating within them, compared to those who do, in terms of their response to these particular security questions, right? So it's showing a marked positive difference of this programming that's offered by Whole House in these particular buildings. And you can just see that sort of display. It's a permanent display that Whole House has in the building, just to let everybody know that they're there. Here are the expectations, and you can do a variety of things with us. Of course, I do want to mention, that there is, of course, within this whole spectrum of possibilities, there is the sort of the old school resident empowerment and activism approach. So this is the neighborhood house, which is a model that exists in Vancouver and it exists in a couple of locations in Toronto. I'm not sure if it exists in the Halton area, but you might have an organization that serves a similar role. So this is a this is a non-government neighborhood house, but that does receive grants for particular work that's related to immigrant social service provision and youth social service provision as well. And that the neighborhood house idea as a hub for a variety of different activities and social needs for people also leads to a growing sense of empowerment, a growing sense of voice that residents have taken up most recently in this campaign to advocate for more equity in services and opportunities delivered to the South Vancouver neighborhood. So very effective. And then the final thing that I just wanted to point to is just the surprising creative experiments and activities that residents themselves have demonstrated an ability to organize, and that the need for, encouragement of these kinds of activities, ranging here from a young entrepreneur who is inviting friends and neighbors to join them to hear about their ideas for entrepreneurial activities. This is in the community of Hope. And then Hutch, which is an experiment based on the little library model, which I imagine that everybody's familiar with, which is that sort of like building these little makeshift homes for book donations. And this instead is for curated rotating art exhibits as well for people from the neighborhood. So these are just residents who have a creative idea. They really barely need any support at all, but encouragement can always help. And can also give people who maybe wouldn't have had that sense of self-confidence to propose something to their neighbors to do so. Okay, so far, in the sociability work that we're doing, we know that we're hearing from some people, and we also know that we are not hearing from some people. And we know some of the reasons for this. We know that personality is one of the reasons, the rules for joining are one of the reasons, and the actions that are and are not being proposed are another set of reasons. So I'm going to ask you to brainstorm through the possibilities that you would propose that could work to encourage neighboring for 3 caricatures. And these are tough characters when it comes to neighboring. And these are actual people that, we're encountering and trying to sort of make a case to them for how to get involved and create opportunities for that. Okay, so neighboring for non-joiners. So I heard this, I'm not a joiner, I'm not a groupie. Why would I get involved in that activity? This is case number 1. And so this person says, we're not acting like we're here forever. I mean, I usually say hi when I see my neighbors. I don't ignore them. or maybe I do, but I try not to. I have a great deal of fear around intimacy, and friendships are nice, but all this other stuff is pretty meaningless. It's nice, but it doesn't mean much. So my question to you is, how would you encourage neighboring activities for that to respond to that critique or that concern? The second kind of character is the person who says, I don't want to just sit around and talk. I want to do real things. That the people who get involved with these kinds of activities are talkers, and that's not me. I'd like action. And here's an example of this person who managed to solve this issue for themselves, I suppose, because they say, finally, I met a neighbor and she helped me out a lot because I was scared to go out because I heard so much about all the crime. So I'm still learning, like how to get around, and she showed me what buses to take to go shopping. So how would you encourage this kind of a characteristic or a caricature to continue their neighboring? And then people who are concerned about rules-oriented moves to promote neighborliness is the third kind of character that I'd ask you to engage. So here's someone who is averse to getting involved in organized groups because of a concern about the rules. And they say, I'll give you an example of something I did, feeling that I was being a good neighbor. In my last place, there was a woman and her husband living next door, and they argued frequently. It concerned me because I've come from domestic violence, and I could never be quite sure. But when the husband wasn't around one day and she was out in the backyard, and I just said, hey, I'd like to give you my number. If there's anything that you'd ever want to talk about, I'm here just to let you know. All right, so Randa, I think, was going to divide everybody up into